Thank you. Thank you, Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 1069, the Protect Our Kids Act. The Chinese Communist Party is executing the most sophisticated global influence campaign of our time. They are not just targeting our military or U.S. companies, they are targeting our children. One of the CCP's key tools is the Confucius Classroom program. These programs are funded, staffed, and overseen by the Chinese government, giving them direct influence over curriculum, teaching materials, and the content presented to American children. We cannot allow an authoritarian regime that censors information, rewrites history, and silences dissent to have any role in American education.
So we are watching a piece of theater right now that should make every single person with a functioning frontal lobe and a commitment to democratic pluralism absolutely goddamn livid, because what Representative Young Kim just delivered from the House floor was not policy analysis or legitimate national security discourse, but rather a masterclass in 21st century yellow peril redux wrapped in the aesthetics of parliamentary procedure. And this matters profoundly because the House has now passed H.R. 1069, legislation whose Orwellian acronym should clue us in immediately to its true function. And what we are witnessing is nothing short of the resurrection of McCarthyite tactics for a generation that never learned the lessons of what happened when Joseph McCarthy stood in front of cameras making wild accusations about communist infiltration that cost many of his victims their reputations and jobs based on fabrications and innuendo masquerading as patriotism. Let me set the stage for the bombshell that nobody in the mainstream discourse wants to acknowledge right now, because it fundamentally undermines the entire premise of this moral panic. And here it is, the inescapable truth that should be shouted from every campus quad and newsroom in America. Federal investigations found no evidence of illegal activity connected to the institutes or classrooms. Did you catch that? Because I want to repeat it for emphasis, since apparently evidence no longer matters when we are crafting foreign policy through the calculus of xenophobic paranoia. There was no evidence of espionage, no evidence of illegal activity, none, and yet we are watching elected representatives stand before the American people, deploying the same rhetorical architecture that gave us the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment camps, the same playbook that destroyed thousands of lives during the Red Scare, when McCarthy leveled charges of disloyalty at celebrities, intellectuals, and anyone who disagreed with his political views, except now instead of rooting out phantom communists in the State Department, we are supposedly protecting children from the existential threat of learning Mandarin. And this brings us to the absolutely crucial contextualization that exposes the rotten foundation of this entire legislative project, because here is what actually happened with Confucius Institutes and Confucius Classrooms in the real world, as opposed to the fever dream construct rep. Kim is selling the number of Confucius Institutes at U.S. universities and colleges declined since 2019, from about 100 to fewer than 5, and the reason they closed had nothing to do with discovered malfeasance or uncovered espionage operations, but rather because more than 60% of respondents stated that the potential loss of or ineligibility for federal funding contributed to a great extent to the institution's decision to close, which is to say that these programs were systematically defunded and pressured out of existence through legislative coercion before any investigation could establish wrongdoing. The government essentially said shut down these language programs or lose your research funding, and then after the closures declared victory over a manufactured threat, a circular logic so transparently authoritarian, it would be laughable if it were not destroying educational opportunities for American students and fomenting hatred against Asian communities. Now let us examine the claim at the emotional heart of Kim's speech, which is designed to activate every parental anxiety receptor and every post-9/11 national security reflex embedded in the American psyche. This notion that the Chinese Communist Party is targeting our children through these classrooms, a formulation so deliberately incendiary and so calculatedly vague that it could mean anything from actual espionage operations to the mere existence of Chinese language instruction in American schools. What does targeting mean in this context? And what precisely is the mechanism of harm being alleged here? Because when we actually look at what these programs did, the reality is far more mundane and far less sinister than the apocalyptic framing suggests. Confucius Institutes typically host extracurricular activities included Chinese New Year festivals, Mid-Autumn festivals, tea ceremonies, art exhibitions, musical performances, film screenings, guest lectures, and conferences. Oh, the horror! Tea ceremonies. The absolute audacity of allowing American children to learn about the world's most populous nation and one of our largest trading partners through cultural programming. Clearly, this represents an assault on American sovereignty that requires immediate legislative intervention. And yes, there were legitimate concerns raised by some educators about a sanitized view of Chinese society that avoids contentious topics like human rights abuses and Tibet, concerns that absolutely warranted scrutiny and the implementation of academic freedom safeguards. But here is the crucial nuance that gets obliterated in Kim's binary formulation. Some schools were able to host conferences and programs that are critical of the CCP, and officials from multiple case study schools noted that U.S. school faculty members make all decisions regarding conference themes, guest speakers, and topics for events at their institute according to the Government Accountability Office. So the actual empirical reality revealed by government investigation was that these institutes operated with varying degrees of autonomy, that some maintained robust academic freedom, while others faced pressure toward self-censorship, that the situation was complex and institution-specific, requiring targeted oversight rather than blanket prohibition. But nuance does not generate viral clips, and complexity does not serve the political project of constructing China as an existential civilizational threat that justifies increasingly draconian measures. What we need and what responsible governance would provide is transparent oversight, mandatory disclosure of foreign funding, enforceable academic freedom protections, the kind of measured regulatory framework that protects legitimate interests without torching the entire enterprise of cross-cultural education. But instead we get H.R. 1069, which would prohibit elementary or secondary schools that receive direct or indirect support from an individual or entity representing the government of the People's Republic of China from receiving funds from the Department of Education, a blunt instrument approach that will inevitably sweep up legitimate educational partnerships and Chinese-American cultural organizations in its dragnet. And here is where we need to talk about what is really happening beneath the surface of this legislation, because it is not actually about protecting children from propaganda, and it is not genuinely concerned with academic integrity. What it represents is the weaponization of education policy in service of a broader geopolitical confrontation with China that treats cultural exchange and language education as threat vectors rather than the diplomatic and economic assets they actually are. Many survey respondents stated that the closure of their Confucius Institute reduced opportunities for Chinese language learning and China-related cultural and academic programming, and this is catastrophic for American competitiveness and national security properly understood, because the U.S. is facing a critical shortage of Mandarin-speaking China experts, and even critics concede the CI program has provided valuable learning experiences otherwise unavailable due to budget constraints and the lack of Mandarin teachers at universities and public schools across the nation. Think about the absurdity of this for a moment. We are in an era of intensifying competition with China across every domain, from technology to trade to military capability. Our intelligence agencies desperately need more analysts with Chinese language proficiency, and our corporations need executives who understand Chinese business culture. Our diplomats need sophisticated knowledge of Chinese history and politics, and the brilliant solution proposed by the China hawks in Congress is to shut down the programs that were actually producing some of that expertise. This is strategic idiocy dressed up as patriotism. It is the educational equivalent of shooting ourselves in the foot and then declaring victory over the bullet, and it exemplifies the bankrupt isolationism that masquerades as America First nationalism while actually undermining every dimension of American power and influence. But the consequences of this McCarthyite revival extend far beyond education policy, because when you stand on the House floor and declare that China is targeting our children through cultural and language programs, you are not operating in a vacuum. You are contributing to and legitimizing a climate of suspicion and hostility toward Asian Americans that has already resulted in devastating violence and discrimination. The data on this is unequivocal and terrifying. Research shows a disturbing escalation of racism and xenophobia, with a 66% surge in anti-Asian slurs following Trump's election win, and online threats of violence spiked by 59% from November to December 2024, according to Stop AAPI Hate. South Asian people were the largest target in recent surges, but East Asians continue to face relentless harassment, and this is not coincidental or disconnected from the political rhetoric we are analyzing. When politicians deploy the language of infiltration and targeting and foreign influence campaigns directed at children, they are activating deeply embedded racial anxieties that have structured American immigration policy and domestic surveillance for over a century. They are invoking the specter of the inscrutable Oriental who cannot be trusted, who maintains dual loyalty, who represents a fifth column within American society, and Asian Americans are not abstract collateral damage in this political theater. They are the direct victims. Many adolescents reported direct experiences of discrimination, such as being called names and bullied online, and these are real children, real families, real communities being scapegoated for geopolitical tensions they have no control over. When Representative Kim talks about protecting our kids, she is performing care for white American children while rendering Asian American children invisible and vulnerable. Traction is replicating the exact logic that justified the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, when national security paranoia overrode constitutional rights and basic human decency. And we cannot ignore the broader pattern here, which is that this anti-China moral panic is being deliberately cultivated and amplified by political actors who benefit from constructing foreign threats to distract from domestic policy failures and consolidate power through fear. Select Committee on China Chairman John Mulliner stated that China wants to influence what American students learn, and these bills will protect them from Chinese propaganda, deploying the exact same argumentative structure that McCarthy used when he claimed communist teachers and Hollywood writers were indoctrinating America's youth. McCarthy would say, "Maybe I got this accusation wrong, but it is still true that there are communists in the government." The same logic of directional correctness that allows fabrication in service of a supposedly higher truth. And we are watching this discredited tactic get rehabilitated in real time. The historical parallel becomes even more chilling when we consider what actually happened during the McCarthy era, because it was not just about ruined careers and blacklists. The Red Scare eroded support for free speech and other civil liberties significantly and created
a climate where dissenting voices from the left side of the political spectrum fell silent on a range of important issues. That is the real function of moral panics. They do not actually address genuine threats. They create permission structures for the suppression of dissent and the narrowing of acceptable political discourse. They make it impossible to have nuanced conversations about complex geopolitical relationships because anyone who questions the prevailing narrative gets labeled a dupe or an apologist or worse, a traitor. And that is exactly what is happening now with China policy, where any suggestion that maybe we should maintain cultural exchanges or that perhaps Chinese students studying at American universities are not all espionage operatives gets you accused of being soft on the CCP. Now let me be absolutely
clear, because I refuse to allow bad faith actors to mischaracterize this analysis. Acknowledging that H.R. 1069 represents xenophobic scapegoating does not require denying that the Chinese government engages in espionage or that there are legitimate concerns about technology transfer or that Xi Jinping's regime commits horrific human rights abuses. We can and must simultaneously oppose the CCP's authoritarianism and reject the racialized hysteria that treats all things Chinese as inherently threatening. We can demand transparency in foreign funding of educational programs and refuse to shut down language education because of nationalist paranoia. We can protect legitimate national security interests and not resurrect the ugliest chapters of American xenophobia in the process. But that requires political courage and intellectual honesty and a commitment to civil liberties that transcends partisan point scoring, qualities that are in desperately short supply in the current Congress. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that
China's influence network in American academia is becoming more ambitious, with signs that Beijing is probing for opportunities in American K-12 schools, and many Confucius classrooms remain in operation, according to recent analysis, which means the very premise that these programs have been eliminated is false. So we have already destroyed the university-level institutes through funding blackmail. We have already decimated Chinese language learning opportunities for college students, and now the next frontier is going after K-12 schools with even more draconian legislation that will stop the flow of CCP funds to K-12 schools, according to supporters. But here is what that actually means in practice. Any school district that accepts any resource, whether it is teaching materials or exchange programs or guest speakers, that has any connection, however tenuous, to Chinese entities, will lose federal education funding. Think about the enforcement mechanism here, and the incredible discretion it grants to government bureaucrats to determine what constitutes indirect support from China. Think about how this will be weaponized against schools and districts with large Chinese American populations who might want their children to learn heritage language. Think about the chilling effect this creates, where educators will self-censor and avoid any curricular content related to China, out of fear of triggering investigation. This is how you construct an infrastructure of surveillance and ideological policing, while claiming you are protecting children. This is how authoritarian impulses get normalized, through the language of security and safeguarding. And anyone who has studied the history of loyalty oaths and communist registration requirements and HWAC investigations should recognize the template immediately. The bitter irony that should not escape anyone's attention is that the controversial Confucius Institutes may have largely shut down under U.S. government pressure, but the partnerships have quietly re-emerged with new names and the same goals, according to analysis of Chinese influence operations. So the legislative crackdown has not actually stopped the thing it purports to stop. It has simply driven relationships underground and made them less transparent and harder to monitor, which is exactly the opposite of what good policy would accomplish. If you genuinely believe that Chinese government influence in education is a problem, then forcing those connections into the shadows where they cannot be scrutinized or regulated is perhaps the stupidest possible approach. But this has never been about effective governance. It has always been about political theater and racial signaling. And we need to discuss the class dimension that is consistently erased in these debates, because while working-class school districts lose access to free language instruction and cultural programming, elite American universities maintain satellite campuses in China, including Duke, Johns Hopkins, New York University, the University of Michigan, as a means to tap wealthy Chinese families for tuition income, so wealthy institutions can continue profiting from educational partnerships with China, while public schools that serve predominantly poor and minority students get cut off from resources that might actually provide social mobility through language acquisition and cross-cultural competency. This is the consistent pattern of American empire. The elite maintain their freedom to operate globally and profit from interconnection, while working people get sold a nationalist fairy tale that their problems stem from foreign threats rather than domestic inequality. The question we should be asking, but almost nobody in power wants to address, is what kind of society are we building when we teach children that learning about other cultures represents a threat rather than an opportunity, when we construct entire ethnic groups as suspect populations requiring constant surveillance, when we prioritize ideological conformity over critical thinking and global competence. Confucius Classrooms are described as a prime example of how foreign-funded programs can shape curricula and exert influence in K-12 classrooms. By Education Committee Chairman Wahlberg. But you know what else shapes curricula in profoundly political ways? Textbook companies that whitewash slavery, energy corporations that fund climate denial in science classes, police departments that run school resource officer programs, the Pentagon's junior ROTC pipeline, billionaire foundations that push privatization through charter networks. But apparently we only care about foreign influence when it comes from China. The double standard is so transparent, it insults the intelligence of anyone paying attention. We have no problem with Alliance Française teaching French language and culture in American schools. We do not accuse the Goethe Institute of being a German intelligence front. We celebrate British Council programs that promote English language learning. We partner with Israeli organizations despite that government's documented human rights abuses. But when it comes to China, suddenly cultural exchange becomes infiltration, and language education becomes propaganda. And yes, China is not a democracy. And yes, the CCP does engage in censorship. And yes, there are meaningful distinctions between authoritarian and democratic governance, but the racialized selectivity of our concern reveals that this is fundamentally about maintaining American hegemony and processing our anxiety about declining global dominance through the scapegoating of Asian bodies. Speaker Mike Johnson declared that this week's passage represents victories for America's parents, students, education system, and national security, but what it actually represents is the prioritization of xenophobic politics over the educational and economic interests of American students. It represents the triumph of McCarthyite demagoguery over evidence-based policymaking. It represents the weaponization of parental anxiety for partisan gain, and the tragic consequences that a generation of American students will graduate with even less understanding of China, even less linguistic capability, even less cross-cultural competence precisely at the historical moment when such knowledge is most crucial for navigating an increasingly multipolar world. We are deliberately making ourselves dumber and more isolated while congratulating ourselves on protecting national security. So when you watch Representative Kim deliver her solemn warnings about Chinese communists targeting our children, understand that you are watching a performance, a carefully choreographed political ritual that has nothing to do with the safety of children and everything to do with the consolidation of a new Cold War consensus that requires Americans to accept increasingly authoritarian domestic policies in the name of confronting foreign threats. Understand that the same forces pushing this legislation are the ones working to ban books from school libraries, to prohibit teaching about systemic racism, to eliminate gender studies programs, to defund public education while funneling money to private religious schools. Their concern for children extends exactly as far as children can be weaponized, to advance a reactionary political agenda and not 1 inch further. The fight against HR 1069 and the broader anti-China moral panic it represents is fundamentally a fight for the kind of society we want to be. Do we want to be a democracy that embraces complexity and protects civil liberties, even in moments of geopolitical tension, or do we want to be a garrison state that treats difference as threat and constructs entire populations as enemies within? Do we want our children to grow up with the linguistic and cultural tools to build a more just and interconnected world, or do we want to raise them in ignorance and fear, told that learning about other civilizations represents contamination rather than education? These are not abstract philosophical questions, they are immediate practical choices that will determine whether American democracy survives the authoritarian temptation that is currently consuming both major parties through different rhetorical vectors. And to every educator watching this, to every parent who wants their child to have opportunities in an interconnected global economy, to every person of Asian descent who is watching their community get scapegoated yet again for political convenience, to everyone who remembers or has learned about what happened during the Red Scare and Japanese internment and the Chinese Exclusion Act, this is your moment to organize and resist and refuse. The historical parallel is not subtle, and the stakes could not be higher because once you establish the precedent that entire categories of knowledge can be banned based on their country of origin, once you normalize the idea that cultural exchange represents infiltration, once you accept that ethnicity determines loyalty, you have abandoned the foundational premises of pluralistic democracy, and you cannot simply reclaim them when it becomes politically convenient. The crackdown on Confucius classrooms is not the end of something, it is the beginning. It is testing ground for far more expansive restrictions on academic freedom and civil liberties, and if we do not stop it now, we will look back with the same shame and bewilderment that we now feel about previous episodes of American xenophobia, and ask how we let this happen again.